Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Ted Harrington. Ted is the author of Hackable, How to Do Application Security Right, and the executive partner at Independent Security Evaluators, or ISE, the company of ethical hackers famous for the first to hack the iPhone, for hacking cars, medical devices, and password managers. He has helped hundreds of companies fix tens of thousands of security vulnerabilities, including Google, Amazon, Netflix, and more. Ted, thank you for coming to our interview today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I think it will be a very interesting interview for us. With your background, I believe we will have a really thoughtful conversation about cybersecurity and emerging threats and how risk and security managers should stop thinking like a defenders and start thinking like a hacker. Ted, can you
Mhm.
tell us a short story about your unique path in the cyber field and what you and your colleagues at Independent Security Evaluators have been up to this day?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the simplest way to think about us is, we're the good guy hackers. um, we when companies are looking to try to understand the security issues inherent in their system, like how would an attacker actually exploit it and what should they do to improve the system? That's ultimately what companies come to us to help them solve. And because of that, I've been really fortunate to be involved with really some just exciting dynamic companies and some really kind of crazy scenarios. And I mean, there's so many that I could think of, but I think one of the short stories that was when I think of like what's a crazy story I've been involved with, one has to do with cryptocurrency. And the idea around this was to give it a little context. We first need to understand this idea that cryptographers call statistical improbability. And statistical improbability basically means that uh, it's more complicated than this, but it essentially means the private key can't be predicted. You can't guess it. It's kind of like if you went to the beach, Boris, and you picked up a grain of sand and you threw it back. And then the next day I went back to that same beach. How likely would I pick up the same grain of sand? Like, it's possible, but it's statistically improbable. And then you multiply that by like every beach on earth and then multiply that by a gazillion earths. And so that's sort of the likelihood that someone could guess a private key that protects a cryptocurrency wallet. You just can't guess them. Or can you? And we've published some research that in fact showed that you could. We were looking at Ethereum wallets, which Ethereum is going, the price of Ethereum is certainly going up right now. And this was a few years ago when we were really curious to understand the way that the software provisions keys. And what we were able to do as a result of this research was we could actually successfully predict the key 732 times.
Wow.
Now, that's like picking up your same grain of sand 732 times, right? It shouldn't be able to happen once, let alone hundreds of times, which that alone is interesting. But it gets more interesting because since cryptocurrency wallets leverage a blockchain, which is, essentially publicly available information, you can actually see the transactions. We could answer the question, well, how much money is at stake here? These 732 wallets, how much money are we really talking about? And it turns out it wasn't a small amount of money. It was at the time worth about $54 million US dollars worth. Today, it's worth considerably more than that. And so that was interesting. Then what was even more interesting was we said, well, if you think about the idea that you've got these vulnerable wallets, someone can actually guess the key to get into them, and there's 54 million US dollars worth of currency there, that's kind of like a pile of cash is just sitting on the sidewalk, right? Someone's going to steal it eventually. And someone did. And because we could see all the transactions because of the blockchain, because of the blockchain that was involved, we could see that every single unit of currency in those 732 vulnerable wallets had all been funneled to a single destination wallet. So like clearly we had stumbled across a hacking campaign in progress where someone was actively stealing from vulnerable wallets using the same vulnerability that our research had found. And maybe the final detail to mention about that story that I think is kind of nuts. We wanted to know how quickly do vulnerable wallets get looted. And so what we did was, the thing about cryptocurrency, they're anonymous. So there's no, we couldn't contact somebody to say, hey, did you know that your wallet is, and there was no one to partner with on this. So what we wound up doing was we said, all right, well, let's just put $1 worth of our own Ethereum in one of these wallets and see what happens. And I mean, it was almost instant that money went right to that same central wallet. So clearly this was not just something that had happened in the past, it was actively happening. And the reason I think that story is interesting, besides the fact that it's just kind of a wild, what's the chances of something like that happening? It tells us some really important facts. The first fact it shows is that software vulnerabilities, security vulnerabilities in software, they exist. And the second fact it shows is that attackers exploit them. And that's the reason I think those two facts are really important, especially for, your entire audience of risk professionals, as well as, for me and everybody that comes more from the sort of ethical hacking and the security viewpoint, is that's why what we do matters, because these aren't hypothetical issues. And I think that's one of the things that is often maybe a struggle that those who work in risk feel, is like, hey, I'm trying to communicate to the business, this is the risk of what might happen. And they kind of dismiss it because it doesn't feel real. It's like, this is what might happen, and this is what that might cost, and here's how we quantify that might. But here's an example. It shows, no, this stuff actually happens. We actually have to take action.
Oh, fantastic. It's a very strong start of the podcast. Ted, could you tell us a little bit about your recent book? What is the main idea of your book, Hackable?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is called Hackable: How to Do Application Security Right. And the thrust of the book is that what I wanted to solve, what I wanted to go set out and do, was to really help people understand how to approach securing software systems differently. Because I noticed two things. The first thing that I noticed was that I kept having the same conversations over and over and over again. As you mentioned, I'm one of the partners in this security consulting company called ISE, and our customers are constantly trying to solve these challenges. And what I noticed was, whether it was talking to our customers or prospective customers or people that I met, after giving a keynote, it seemed like everybody had the same common problems. And there were roughly about 10 of those problems that sort of everybody had, no matter how large or small the company was, what geographic region it was, what industry sector it was in, how mature the security program was. They all kind of had these same issues. And once I noticed that, of course, that's interesting. Then what I did was I started thinking about, well, how do you solve those problems that sort of everybody has? I really started thinking through that. And that was the moment that just was the swift kick in the butt that said, you must write this book. And that was that I recognized that the conventional approaches, the ways that most people talk about dealing with these sort of 10 or so common problems that everybody has, the conventional approaches to those are pretty universally backwards. There's so many misconceptions. And I know the right way to do it because this is, I like help companies with it every single day. And I said, well, I can't let that continue to happen. Because I mean, think about what that really means, right? That means that you've got someone who is building a business in some way. They recognize that security is an important part of that mission. They recognize they have some challenges in order to do security right. So they go out and try to solve and address those challenges. And the answer they get isn't correct. And I said, no, that I can't let that condition exist anymore. So I sat down to write the book. It addresses the misconceptions that hold most organizations back. It replaces them with, here's what you should do instead. Of course, it's filled with stories like the one I just told about the blockchain bandit, which is what we named that thief. And it's all real world examples from the front lines of ethical hacking, with this goal of saying, look, we can do this better. And for that reason, the book is from page, 1 to the last page. It is filled with the exact same type of advice that we give to our clients and our prospective clients. So that's the goal of it. Help organizations build better, more secure software systems.
Oh, fantastic. Let's discuss a scenario where you are a hacker or an ethical hacker, and you are trying to find a vulnerability in the company. Without putting a lot of details, can you describe in few steps what your sequence of action will be?
Sure. Well, I can explain it in a story. So this is sort of a metaphorical story. I mean, it's a true story, but it's about it's a social engineering story as opposed to a technical exploit story. But social engineers are ethical hackers too, and I think that it very vividly sort of paints the picture. So a few years ago, I was going to meet up with some friends at a bar near my house here in California. And I can't remember exactly why I needed to go to this specific bar. I think maybe it was like someone's birthday, but we had to go to this one. It wasn't like, hey, let's go to this neighborhood. It was like, we're going to this specific place. And by the time I got there, I showed up a little bit later than everybody else. There was a really long line to get in. It was a popular place. And once you wait through that line, you had to pay $20 cover charge to get in. And I really wanted nothing to do with either of those things. So what I did was I sort of applied the mindset that really any hacker, whether they're an ethical hacker or an attacker, applies, and said, how can I make this system behave differently than it's supposed to? That's the fundamental thing that everyone who falls under the hacker moniker, which is some are good and some are bad, but they're both hackers. Anyone who's a hacker looks at a system and says, how can I make this system behave differently? And so the first thing that I did, and this is what anyone do, is, you set a goal. And so step one, set a goal. And my goal was I wanted to find a way to bypass the line and bypass the cover charge. So I have my goal now. Second thing I did is then evaluate how the system works, actually understand the mechanics of the system, how the components work together. In this case, I recognized that, hey, you've got a VIP line. And the VIP is where, if you're on the list or you can associate yourself with the list, you don't have to wait in line and you don't have to pay cover. So my goal now was bypass the line by associating myself with VIP. I want to use that functionality in the furtherance of the attack. So I walked up to the VIP hostess and I said, hi, I'm on the list. Now, I wasn't on the list and I didn't know anybody on the list, but I needed her to believe that I was on the list. So what I needed to have happen was I needed her to give me information. And so this is now the next step in what really any attacker does, is start to probe the system to find information. And so when she asked me what my name was, instead of giving my name or guessing a name, because the chance that I'm right on that is, it's just not going to work, I said, I'm with the group. Now that's what's called a specially crafted input. Specially crafted input is what an attacker will, or either type of hacker will use in order to see how the system behaves. And so the specially crafted input, I'm with the group, got her to respond saying, great, which group? Now, again, I'm not on the list. I don't know anyone on the list. I don't know what groups there are. So guessing isn't going to help. I need her to tell me who the groups are. So again, I issued a specially crafted input, which in this case was, well, I'm with the big one. And with that, she looks down at her clipboard, flips a couple pages, and she says, oh, the Smith party? And I said, yes, I'm with the Smith party. And so that was, of course, the next step. Now you identify the vulnerability, you see, can you actually exploit it? And it turns out that I could. She raised the velvet rope, escorted me past the line, past the cashier, and into the bar. That was a very successful process that I went through that mirrors the exact steps that that a hacker would go through, where you identify the goal, evaluate the system, issue specially crafted inputs, see how it reacts. Of course, woven in there was identifying assumptions, like the assumption that the VIP hostess assumed that if I could produce a group's name, I was with a group. So that was an assumption that I was probing to see if that was valid or not. And ultimately, then once you find an issue, you determine, is it exploitable or not? Because some vulnerabilities are maybe impossible to exploit or very difficult to exploit. And so that's more or less the process. There's obviously way more levels of complexity to it than that, but that simplifies it. I mean, I think everybody's waited in a line before or had to pay for access to something before they didn't want to. So we've kind of all had that experience as human beings. I'll end it with the note that I'm more than made up for that cover charge with my bar tab. I overtipped everybody. It was part of research. So everyone got taken care of, but that's
I,
essentially the process.
I think I can share with you. I did almost the same story when I was in the airport lounge, and I wanted to just not stay in the common area because it was too crowded. So I imagined some story like this because I wasn't a part of a lunch, and they gave me entry. So it's
Nice.
fantastic. And this is also in your book. You describe this kind of situations. All right.
Yeah, that story I broke down with, of course, even additional detail in the book, outlined the exact steps. I mean, that was one of the things I wanted the book to do, was not only to inform and entertain through stories, but to also say, okay, now that you have the concept, do this, do this, do this, and then do this. And so that's exactly what it does. And then there's a whole part in the book too that I just laid out sort of the process components of how you might go about exploiting a system. But then there's a whole other method for what are the different aspects to security testing that should happen, and where do different companies come up short. But we can get into that later if you want. But that's also in the book, is walking people through sort of those specifics.
No, fantastic. So, uh, tell us, what is a commonly held belief in the cybersecurity field, or probably biggest misconceptions that you strongly disagree with?
Yeah, I mean, I got a book full of them. There's so many that are problematic. But one we might focus on is one that is very surprising, I think, to a lot of people. I mean, even today, in the year that we live in, people are still surprised by this. And it's the distinction about how should we share information. So to set the context of what I'm talking about here, companies who are building software systems, they already know that they need to engage some sort of outside security expert to help them with security testing. They either know that inherently because they understand the benefits of it, or because their customers requiring it. But most people already recognize that. But where the misconception comes in is how to actually work with those organizations. And most people hold on to this misconception that's pretty bad, actually, of what's called black box testing. And what they want to do instead is what's called white box testing. Now, here's the distinction. The distinction boils down to information. It's purely about information. So in black box testing, information is intentionally withheld. So for example, a company might hire security evaluators and might say, okay, here's the system. We want you to actually test it. We want you to do a penetration test, which that's its own. There's a lot of issues with that term because a lot of people don't know what it means. We want you to do our penetration test here, and we want to do it black box. And what they mean to say is, we don't want to give you any information about how the system works. We want you to emulate real world conditions, right? We want you to act like an attacker will act. Now, the motivation behind that is reasonable. I understand where they're coming from. They're saying like, well, if the attacker doesn't have this information, my security evaluator shouldn't have it either, because I want to see what the real world looks like. But it's incredibly flawed. What you actually want to do is instead what's called white box, where you actually share information. You share access to source code, design documents, access to engineers. And the reason is that if the goal is to actually find security vulnerabilities, fix them, and improve the security posture, sharing information is an incredibly powerful way to do that. And when you withhold information, all kinds of bad things happen. So the metaphor here is, if you can imagine a medieval castle. Certainly plenty of those across Europe. It shouldn't be hard for your audience to imagine what a medieval castle is going to look like. Now imagine the king back in medieval times, and the king wants to know, can my enemies assassinate me? And so what the king does is he orders one of his loyal nobles to send some knights to try to break into the castle. Now, in a black box format, what would happen is the king would say, well, I'm not going to tell the knights anything about the castle. They're just going to try to break in. So now what do the knights do? The knights show up to the castle. They see there's a moat. They start counting alligators. They're like, oh, there's one. There's one. Okay, so we've got this many turrets. Okay, I see archers on the turrets. Oh, I see the guy right there with the hot oil. He's going to spill that over. Okay, I can see a bunch of these things. Does that help the king? It doesn't help the king at all because the king already knew those things. So all the time and effort that they just spent counting alligators, the king could have just said, oh, there's 7 alligators. Okay, cool. We now have that information. And with that information, we can now use it to understand what are the potential vulnerabilities we should be looking for. And that's really one of these big drawbacks with black box. You think you're emulating real world conditions, but really what you're doing is you're reducing the value of the input that your security partners will give you. Ultimately, you're not testing your system, you're testing the partner. You're saying, can this security company get into this system with this amount of time? Whether they can or they can't doesn't really tell you anything about your enemies. And that's one of the real big misconceptions is we got to move away from this misapplied adherence to black box testing. The black box testing does have its uses. Like if you want to test whether a system leaks information, okay, that's good for that. But when the goal is to actually find vulnerabilities and fix them, you really want to do white box. And that's where, the king would take the knights and, walk across the drawbridge and say, hey, in that moat, there's 7 alligators. And here's how the interior compartments of the castle work. Here's our evacuation plan in the event of a siege, those kinds of things. Now the knights can say, okay, well, this is potentially an issue, this part right here. So let's focus on whether or not someone could exploit that.
Fantastic. This is a comparison. This is a story is a very vivid explanation of all these possibilities. So could you tell with regards to risk management, how risk ethical hackers, what they can do to help mitigate risks and help organizations, specifically risk managers and security officers in the real situations?
Yeah, so really what ethical hackers do in regards to risk is 2 things. Number 1, actually understand it, right? Be able to measure it. And number 2, be able to reduce it. And one of the big challenges that I see really across industries is that when it comes to security, the actual risk of a certain situation isn't really well understood by the business. And here's what's crazy about that is that the business is making a decision either way. Whether they have the information or they don't have the information, they're making a decision. And so my advocacy is, well, let's have the information so we can make the right decision. And so, the difference between black box and white box is an example where I just mentioned where information actually delivers results that help you understand risk and then decide what to do about it. The thing about risk is that, I mean, obviously, it's a whole profession unto itself. And I didn't attempt to redefine risk in my book. What I attempted with my book to do was to help inform how to think about risk. And one of the points that I make in the book is that let's accept this condition, right? The condition is that security vulnerabilities exist. The only difference is whether or not an organization has discovered them. So they exist either way. Was enough effort put into actually finding them? Because once you've found them, once you understand that the issues exist, now you can actually make a risk-based decisions. Because if you're able to look at a system and say, we have these 30 issues, you can actually make the decision to say, we're going to do nothing about them. We're going to just accept these 30. And that's, while I maybe don't agree with it in every situation, that's okay because you're making that decision actively. The problem that I see is when organizations try to either cut significantly or in some cases eliminate their investment in security testing, in doing it the right way. So as a result, the only thing that happens is that they don't find the vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities still exist. They just don't know about them. So now they're still making a decision. They're accepting those vulnerabilities, but they don't realize they're accepting them. And that's the real problem. So when how security, how ethical hacking, how risk, how all these things intersect is around that idea. The issues exist. Are we investing the appropriate amount of time, effort, and money in order to identify and understand those issues so we can make decisions based on risk?
Fantastic. So how, based on what you said just now, how organizations, on even just small guys like software engineers, should go about finding issues so we can build more secure solution and software?
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, security is a team sport, is the way that I describe it. It requires collaboration between, the business itself, the leadership in the technology leadership. So whether that's the CTO or the vice president of engineering or whoever it is, all the way to engineers and developers themselves, partnership with the outside security partners. And so the question around what should an engineer do? I mean, ultimately, the decision around who to partner with, how to partner with them, how much money to spend, what the goals are, all those things ultimately are going to be the decision at the leadership level. The individual engineer their job is to, of course, build the thing, and they're going to react to the marching orders that are effectively handed to them. But that doesn't mean that they're powerless. It does, to a certain extent, mean, an engineer listening to this isn't going to be able to say, well, I guess I'll go free up, a couple $100,000 of budget to go do something. It's like, that's not going to happen. But what an engineer can do is an engineer can think about how to approach security in the actual building process. And I talk about this at length in the book, but there's some really clear moments in the dev process where an engineering activity is happening, and there's an not equal, but there is a relevant security action that happens then too. So for example, when an organization is, let's say, designing what they're going to be doing, they've already established requirements. They said it needs to do this. And now, because it needs to do whatever that is, it's going to look like this. So have a security conversation around that, right? So the engineers are going to be, of course, in the room talking about these are the components and here's how they're going to interact in order to achieve those requirements. Well, there should be a security voice in the room too, saying, okay, based on that design, here are what would hypothetically be the security issues. And the beauty of that conversation at that time is, imagine, we're talking about on a whiteboard, right? So it's like this circle draws to this square. And when you realize that relation maybe has some security issues to it, what are you able to do? You're able to say, well, why don't we instead make the circle go to this triangle and then go to the square? We've just changed. That didn't require any effort other than the 5 minutes to talk about it and erase it on a whiteboard. But we've now set it up so that when the actual building happens, when the development process, the engineering is underway, you're building the right thing in the right way. And that's so powerful. And so that's my big advocacy, is that at every stage of the process, there is a security action to be taken. Don't push security off to the end.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So we are now living in the work from home situation. I know that it adds more challenges to security officers. They have to install all this security access to all these people that that were working in premises. Now they have to work in home. So what do you see? How this situation actually involved? What you see on your from your point of view as a consultant to the industry?
So I always try to find the silver lining and everything. Most security people are like, the sky is falling, doom and gloom. And I'm like, well, wait, there's a ray of sunshine coming through. And obviously, I don't mean to be cavalier about what the entire human race has been through over the last year with the pandemic. It's obviously been just a real tragedy in so many ways, but there are some really good things that have come out of it. And one of the many things that I think that are really good that have come out of it is that companies are now more aware of security. So the fact that you even asked the question in the way that you did, that kind of question is being asked every day in companies all over the world. And it's so exciting because those conversations weren't really happening to the same degree, at least at the same scale, all across the world. I mean, there were companies, of course, asking those questions, but for the most part, I think a lot of companies still think of security as a niche topic. To put this into context, I'm a keynote speaker, and when you look at what are the topics that organizations and associations are tending to look for their keynote speakers, cybersecurity, the entire field of cybersecurity, I'm not even talking about ethical hacking, the entire field of cybersecurity is still considered a niche topic. I'm
Uh-huh.
like, no, this impacts every company, every academic institution, every government in every place in the world. But people still think it's like this thing that's niche, and it's not. And so what the pandemic has done is it's forced those conversations where people are like, our model has just changed. We no longer control the infrastructure here at our physical site at our office. Our people are now distributed. How do we deal with that? And asking that question, now the answer to the question is important too, but that question is what matters. And that's so important to security that we're constantly asking the question, how are we dealing with change? Fundamentally, that's what the pandemic forced to the front of everyone's minds. Things have changed. How do we deal with that? And that's what us as security professionals, and that's what risk professionals are doing as well too. We're trying to drive awareness of the fact that, hey, things have changed. That means the risk profile has changed, the attack profile has changed. We have to think about how we're going to adapt.
Okay. So maybe finalizing, if someone who is listening to this interview would like to walk away with one or two major takeaways, what would that be?
I think the big thing that we haven't talked about yet necessarily, but that weaves all of these things together would be this takeaway. It's that most people think about security and risk as well as this idea of how do we avoid a bad thing, right? Suffering a security breach is a bad thing. What do we need to do in order to minimize the likelihood of that happening or minimize the impact of that happening? And that's a very valid way to think about security. How do we avoid a bad thing? But what's not enough talked about, and this is one of the main arguments I make in my books, one of the main arguments I make to anyone who will listen to me speak about it, it's the reason that so many of our customers actually hire us, is because there's a second way to think about security too. In addition to how do we avoid a bad thing, it's how do we pursue a good thing? And this is the very often overlooked benefit that security can deliver, is that security delivers a competitive advantage. So for a company that is, building a software system, and even if it's not a commercial business, right? Even nonprofits, academic institutions, ultimately, when technology is at the heart of the decision, we're trying to convince somebody else that they should use it. They should spend, even if it's not money, maybe it's time, or allocate other resources towards it. So we're trying to convince people, right, that this technology should be used. Well, when you can first secure it and then second, prove it, that's enormously differentiating, because most organizations really struggle to secure their systems. And even those who do secure them really struggle to prove it. So that's an enormous opportunity, because think about that. The person on the other side of that transaction, the person who's going to buy that solution or use the solution, they want the solutions that they use to be secure. So let's call that X, right? The buyer wants X, yet almost nobody can give them X. If you can give them X, that's a competitive advantage. That's enormously differentiating. It's what the buyer wants. And I talk in the book about exactly how to do that, how to actually prove it. You, of course, have to secure it first. You can't try to prove something that, isn't actually secure. But once you secure it, here's how you prove it. And that's the big thing that I definitely want people to take away from this with, is that, hey, here's this untapped opportunity. It's a totally different way to think about investing in security, because now it's no longer how do we minimize the amount of dollars we spend in order to minimize the amount of risk that we're accepting. That's the way that most people think about risk. Instead, now we're saying, hey, that's, of course, let's keep thinking about it that way. But let's also say, how can we convert a certain number of dollars invested into a certain number of dollars earned? Because when you can give the customer what they want, that leads to sales closing faster. It's a competitive advantage. Like I said, it's something you can very much market. And so that's really, I think, a big thing that companies, that not just companies, anybody here listening can and should take away from this.
Fantastic. I believe I would like to speak with you more and more, but we have to be in the format of our kind of, maybe in a few months we will have another session. But from
Cool.
our own perspective as a kind of global risk community, we kind of risk managers who communicate online, what would you suggest? How can we contribute better to for better understanding this complex world of risk?
Well, I think anybody who's listening to this show is already doing the first step, which is just be a continuous learner. I mean, all of us are driving to be better, to learn more, to level up our skills. And I definitely want to, make it clear to offer myself to everybody who's listening to this, right? Use me as a resource, right? So not only listening to this, but if anything I talked about here today, you want more advice on any of these ideas, you want to learn more about the book, you want to follow me on social media, you want to contact me about maybe security testing needs at your company, you want to talk to me about, hey, coming to speak at your company or your organization, however I can help, like I'm a resource, just go to tedharrington.com. All that information is there. Reach out to me. My commitment to you guys is to help. And so just keep doing what you're doing. Keep pushing for continuous learning. Use the resources around you. And that's the big thing. Keep pushing.
Okay, thank you, Ted. I will put in show notes, I will put a link to your book and your website so people will know where to to look for. So thank you for your time and for your fantastic interview. And I wish you a great success with your good ethical job and
Well, thanks so much for having me.
education drive. Absolutely. Thank you.
I love it.
Bye.
Thank you so much.